Welcome to What's in a Name? The Story of Ewart College. Ewart College was a training school formed in 1897 to prepare Presbyterian women for work both in overseas mission fields and in Canada. As you will hear, it evolved to become much more. In 1991, Ewart College was amalgamated with Knox College. Our presenters today are myself, Anne McGillivray, librarian and archivist at Caven Library, Knox College. Nicole D'Angela, assistant archivist for the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Laura Alary, library assistant and coordinator of the Mackay Educational Resource Center at Caven Library, Knox College. Kim Arnold, archivist for the Presbyterian Church in Canada, participated in preparing this presentation, but is unable to be here today. Sach Prashad from Knox College is providing technical support. This presentation will be recorded, though the recording will be turned off for the question and answer session. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or type them in the chat and we will address them at the end of the presentation.
At its February meeting in 1990, the board of Ewart College had a vision. It imagined an alternative model for theological education, one which would consolidate the existing Presbyterian colleges and offer students a chance to branch into different forms of preparation for the changing needs of church and society. While there is no record that anyone proposed a name for this new central place of learning, the board did note that a new identity for the Center for Theological Studies will begin with the choice of a new name. But this new identity and new name never came to be. 16 months later, at the 1991 General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, a decision was made to amalgamate Ewart College and Knox College to form one institution, henceforth to be known as Knox College. Names matter. When a name is lost, the forgetting of the story begins. So today we want to remember not only the various names Ewart College has had over the years, but also the names of some of its graduates, their work and experiences, and the impressions they left upon the church and Canadian society. While we tell this story, you'll notice that one of the key names we use changes. For most of the 20th century, graduates of Ewart College were designated as deaconesses, and for decades, many women bore that name with pride. To honor them and for historical accuracy, we will use the term deaconess for the first part of our presentation. However, in 1984, the name of the order was changed to the Order of Diaconal Ministries, and those designated to it, diaconal ministers. Again, out of respect for historical accuracy and to clarify that diaconal ministry is indeed ministry, that change of name will be reflected in the language we use to tell the story. Now, to help set the scene of the church in the late 1800s, we'll begin with a short story published in 1903. The Strike at Putney tells the tale of the chaos that ensues when the Women's Foreign Mission Auxiliary of the fictional Presbyterian Church in Putney, invites Mrs. Cotterill, a noted missionary, to speak at their society one Sunday evening. The women plan to hold the event in the sanctuary because the larger space can accommodate more people. To their dismay, every single church elder declares that no woman has any place in the pulpit of Putney Church, even on a Sunday evening. After some discussion, the women decide they must strike. From that moment, life at Putney Church begins to unravel. There is no ice cream social to raise money to pay for the new carpet. The church is dusty and unkempt, with only a vase of dead flowers for decoration. Most of the choir is missing, as is the organist. There are no society meetings. Sunday school is a harrowing failure. In the end, the elders have little choice but to concede. Mrs. Cotterill can occupy the pulpit after all. In this witty and very pointed story, L.M. Montgomery gives us a glimpse into the Presbyterian Church at the turn of the 20th century. It's a church where some women are fulfilling their vocations as missionaries overseas, but are nevertheless blocked from access to other leadership roles. Other women are locally active within the limits imposed by male leadership. But the message of the story is clear. The whole church is utterly dependent on the faithful, diligent, and often underappreciated work of women.
Against this backdrop, the story of Ewart College begins. By the early 1890s, the Confederation of Canada's provinces was still only a couple of decades old. New railroads opened up Western Canada for farming and settlement, particularly by European immigrants seeking to start new lives. In the churches, there was great enthusiasm for missions, both in foreign lands and in Canada's west and north. The Presbyterian Record devoted many pages each month to reports from various mission fields. Missionaries were regarded as heroes, and many young people were inspired by them to devote their lives to sharing their faith around the world. Young men could attend any one of 6 Presbyterian colleges to prepare for this service. But there was no such choice for young women, whose options for education and careers were still very limited. The University of Toronto, for example, only admitted women students in 1884. Despite these obstacles, by 1890, the Presbyterian Church in Canada had sent more than 20 women overseas as missionaries. Mrs. Catherine Ewart was president of the Women's Foreign Missionary Society, the Western Division of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. She saw the need for proper training for women missionaries and pushed quietly and steadily for the establishment of a facility to do this. After 5 years, her work bore fruit, though she died just before seeing it. In 1897, Catherine Ewart's home on Church Street in Toronto became the Ewart Missionary Training Home. What was life like for those first students of the training home? First, it really was a home where the students lived as well as studied, paying $3 a week for room and board. It had a superintendent, a mature woman who was to supply motherly supervision to the students and influence them for good. The first 2 superintendents were widows of ministers, a subsequent one a returned missionary, and another the former principal of a girls' school. An advertisement from the Presbyterian Record in December 1899 gives some idea of the breadth of the curriculum. Bible, theology, church history, mission work, Sabbath school work, health and sanitation, bookkeeping, elocution, and city mission work. In short, a mixture of theoretical and practical skills. Completion of the 2-year curriculum earned a diploma, although there was an option for a 1-year certificate. Many of the classes were taught by Knox College professors in a classroom at Knox set aside for the women. Other classes were taught by Toronto ministers and qualified outsiders like Dr. P.H. Bryce of the Provincial Health Department. The Ewart Missionary Training Home was not a big organization by today's standards. Between 5 and 9 students were registered in the first year. The first graduating class in 1899 had 2 students. But by 1913, the writer of the Knox College report to General Assembly bemoans the low numbers of male graduates at Knox, but praises the splendid class of 30 young women from Presbyterian Missionary and Deaconess Training Home, who are receiving a large part of their training in Knox College and from its professors.
While the training home was established to educate missionaries, it also attracted young women who wished to serve the church in other ways. Other denominations, such as the Anglicans and Methodists, had deaconess orders for such work. In 1908, the Presbyterian Church in Canada approved the establishment of a Presbyterian order of deaconesses. The name of the school changed accordingly to the Ewart Missionary and Deaconess Training Home, and later, in 1910, to the Presbyterian Missionary and Deaconess Training Home, to emphasize the connection between the school and the whole church. In addition to the name, a uniform was part of the identity of these early deaconesses. Here's an example of the uniform from around 1917, a navy blue dress and tailored coat with white celluloid collar and cuffs and a velvet bonnet. This uniform conveyed both professionalism and authority. It also had a practical benefit. It gave the wearer half-fare rates on the railroads. Graduates found work in many spheres besides foreign missions. For example, free kindergartens, visiting the sick at home and in hospitals, visiting prisoners, working with young women, welcoming and assisting newcomers to Canada, house-to-house visitation, teaching English to immigrants, assisting the sick and poor, distributing relief, holding Bible classes, teaching sewing and household management. Those who went overseas as missionaries were often able to work with women and children in cultures where male missionaries could not. In short, by the first decades of the 20th century, Ewart had evolved from being a small home base for training women as overseas missionaries to a school which launched young women into many fields of service within and beyond the church. This broadening of purpose aligned with changes and opportunities for women in Canadian society as a whole. The First World War and the suffrage movement brought newfound freedom and choice to many, though not all, women.
1925 was a pivotal year for Presbyterians in Canada. This was the year of church union, when Congregationalists, Methodists, and most Presbyterians joined to form the United Church of Canada. About 1/3 of Presbyterians chose not to join this union, transforming them almost overnight from a large and influential part of the landscape in Canada to a much smaller denomination. The building and property that had been home to the training school was turned over to the new United Church. Nevertheless, applications from prospective students were still being received, and those who remained were determined to adapt. After a brief closure in the fall of 1925, the school reopened in 1926 in rented quarters. A year later, property was purchased at 156 St. George Street, and that's what you see in the photo. This would be the home address of the school for the next 65 years. In 1927, though, there was lots of work to be done. The house was run down, the kitchen filthy, gas fixtures and several doors had been removed, and many other renovations were needed to make it fit for accommodation. The house's location, however, was ideal, just down the street from Knox College, where the students received much of their instruction, and close to the libraries and other amenities of the University of Toronto. By the 1930s and 40s, there were signs that the school was evolving as an educational institution. The head of the school now had the title principal instead of superintendent. In 1941, the name of the school changed again to the Presbyterian Missionary and Deaconess Training School instead of home. Entrance standards were raised from junior matriculation, or grade 12 in Ontario, to senior matriculation, grade 13, in the 1940s. A third year was added for specialization. Courses reflected a new emphasis on Christian education and congregational work. In 1936, Knox College decided to stop supplying teachers and space for the training school. So in response, the school hired its first paid lecturer. Nancy Smith was a graduate of Wycliffe College with distinguished standing, who had nevertheless been denied the diploma because she was a woman. From 1937 to 42, Mrs. Smith taught Bible and church history, while other subjects were covered by ministers from nearby churches or members of church boards. None of these external lecturers was paid. Only later in the 1940s did Ewart lecturers finally receive honoraria. And in 1946, Knox resumed supplying space and instruction to students at the training school.
The demand for graduates continued to grow. In the turmoil of the 1930s and 1940s, with the Great Depression followed by the Second World War, deaconesses took on new challenges. Some, like Bessie McMurtry, still went overseas as missionaries. Bessie, who had also trained as a nurse in Montreal, worked in the Jobat Hospital in the Beal region in India for many years, nursing, helping set up mobile clinics, and teaching nursing to local people. Those who stayed home began to do less social work and worked more directly with congregations. Some graduates served three-point charges where they regularly led services and preached. Others did Christian education, worked with children and youth, and ran women's groups. Some taught in schools supported by the college or by the church. Wherever they ended up, there were challenges. These women needed to learn, maybe for the first time, how to do things like ride a horse or bike, drive a car or truck, or even a horse and buggy. They were expected to direct camps, even if they had never been to camp themselves. They led funerals, did pastoral visitation, and even dealt with mice in their church buildings. They were nothing if not adaptable. As Joyce Davis writes in her book, From the Bottom Up, this diversification in the practice of ministry highlights an important principle underlying the call that members of the order consider fundamental. It is the willingness to answer God's call to service, whatever need presents itself, from leading in worship to helping in a nursing emergency. Adaptability in response to the needs of the church is a key element in the order's vision of diaconal ministry.
The church was changing quickly. After World War II, people were ready to embrace stability, to settle down and have families. The baby boom began in the late 1940s and lasted into the early 60s. These growing families decided that church was a priority. The 1950s saw all-time highs in church and Sunday school attendance. New Sunday school curricula were cutting edge, incorporating insights from critical scholarship and the latest educational theory, not to mention contemporary art. Leading the way was the Christian Faith and Life curriculum, edited by a Canadian Presbyterian, the Reverend Dr. James Smart. Although he moved to the US to do this editing work, upon returning to Canada, Dr. Smart sat on the board of Ewart and taught classes there. Around this time, as the women's movement gained momentum in society more broadly, some women in the church were openly questioning why they could not be ordained to the ministry of word and sacraments. In 1953, the Presbyterian Church in Canada formed a committee to look into the role of women in the church. The 1950s and 60s became a time for consultation, conversation, and some intense arguments. Meanwhile, the training school continued to grow. From the beginning, the school had been administrated by one person, the superintendent or principal. In the 1950s, a dean was added to the staff to take charge of the residents and to direct the practical and field training of students. By now, the building had become a big problem. The house at 156 St. George Street was overcrowded and could no longer accommodate all the school's residents. Furthermore, as a house, it did not meet the needs of a modern school. There was no classroom space, no library, insufficient office space, and no chapel. In 1958, the school was given permission by the church to raise funds for a new building. Margaret Taylor, chair of the board, led the campaign and spent months traveling across Canada to raise money. In 1962, a new building opened at the same location as the old. It had 4 floors with a chapel, an assembly hall, a lounge, office space, a dining room and kitchen, a library, 3 classrooms, a resource room, a craft room, residence space for 60 people, and student common rooms. It also had a new name. Ewart College.
By 1970, Ewart no longer relied on Knox College to teach Bible and theology to its students. Both the principal and the dean taught academic courses, and a third instructor had been hired. New programs allowed students to study for a degree at the University of Toronto while simultaneously earning a diploma from Ewart. A printed booklet was prepared to recruit women to Ewart and the career of deaconess. The deaconess in the Presbyterian Church in Canada was printed first in 1964 and again in 1967. It outlined possible jobs in congregations, presbyteries, and synods, as well as national, international, and overseas positions. The work done in presbyteries still reflected the range of tasks done by deaconesses in the early 20th century: hospital visitor, port worker with new immigrants, downtown worker, institutional worker. But that boom in church attendance in the 50s and 60s meant that many Ewart graduates ended up working in Christian education. This could take different forms. Some deaconesses did van work. Teams of 2 would drive a van in summer months around areas, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where there was no church. They would visit families, hold worship services, lead vacation Bible schools, among other things, like digging their vans out of ditches. In congregations, large enrollments in Sunday schools meant a lot of administrative work as well as teaching. Other deaconesses served as regional secretaries for Christian education. To reflect this reality, in 1969, Ewart College decided to change the focus of its curriculum to Christian education. By the end of the 1960s, then, the college had come of age with its own faculty, a new and modern building, and a fresh sense of purpose and direction.
But the scene was shifting again. In 1966, after more than a decade of discussion and debate, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada approved the ordination of women. This decision opened up new conversations about the definition of ministry. As we have seen in the past, women who felt called to serve God through professional church work were limited in their choices. Some Ewart graduates became deaconesses because they could not be ordained to the ministry of word and sacraments. But others felt called to a different kind of ministry, diaconal ministry. As Joyce Davis writes, most made the choice not to pursue ordination because they felt their gifts did not lie in preaching and/or leading a congregation. An overwhelming reason for many was their understanding of ordination as a setting apart, which often created a gulf between minister and people. The great desire of many deaconesses was to enable the ministry of all the people. In the 3 or 4 years following the decision of 1966, enrollment at Ewart fell. But it quickly recovered and remained strong through the 1970s and 80s, with a high of 43 students in 1979. The Ewart residence was a lively and thriving place, home to more than Ewart students. Missionaries on furlough stayed there, as did female students from other Toronto colleges who wanted a Christian environment. A 4th member was added to the faculty in 1976. Now the college had a principal, dean, and 2 full-time faculty. Ewart College received its first male student in 1970, and by 1979, this number had climbed to 8. But if they were to join the Order of Deaconesses upon graduation, the name of the order needed to be changed. So, in 1984, the Order of Deaconesses became the Order of Diaconal Ministries, and its members known as diaconal ministers.
It is at this point, when Ewart College seemed to be at its strongest, that the Presbyterian Church in Canada delivered a blow. The denomination was having financial troubles and was seeking ways to economize. In 1985, the General Assembly directed the Senate of Knox College and the Board of Ewart College to form a joint consultation to explore possibilities for greater cooperation. The following year, these bodies came back to the Assembly with two options, the Ewart option and the Knox option. The Ewart option proposed by the Ewart Board was for Knox and Ewart to consider offering a joint Master of Religious Education program, but for Ewart to continue to offer its own distinct programs for both graduate and undergraduate students, because there still was a need for diversity of preparation for service in the church. The Knox option, proposed by the Senate of Knox College, was for Ewart College to transition to a master's level program offered through a Ewart Department of Christian Education, which would be part of Knox College. For the next 4 years, the fate of Ewart College and the future shape of theological education was discussed by presbyteries, general assemblies, special committees, and task forces. Finally, in 1990, the Task Force on Theological Education reported their conclusion. The church could consolidate resources by integrating diaconal education with training for ministry of word and sacraments. This integration should start immediately. As of fall 1990, the Ewart program would be detached from its home at Ewart College and transferred to Knox. The property at 156 St. George Street was sold. Professors Helen Goggin and Bob Mathewson moved to Knox while the principal, Irene Dixon, retired. Ina Adamson, the former dean, retired in 1986, and her replacement, R.F.G. Campbell, had been hired for a 3-year contract, which was not renewed. Some Ewart furnishings were brought to Knox, including the cross and communion table from the chapel, and an effort was made to acknowledge the Ewart presence at Knox. A side chapel of the main Knox chapel was designated as the Ewart Chapel. Books from the library were added to the Caven Library collection. A few years later, the Mackay Educational Resource Center was opened, funded by the Ewart Endowment, with the purpose of providing Christian education resources to students and local churches. The Ewart Chair of Christian Education was established for a faculty member to teach in the area of Christian education. Finally, a revamped Master of Divinity degree included an option for specializing in Christian education. Despite these efforts, this was a time of deep disappointment for many. Those associated with Ewart College grieved the loss of their building, their name, their programs, and their distinctive approach to ministry and preparing for it. "33 years later, where do we see the presence of Ewart College at Knox College? Physically, the Ewart Chapel remains in the transept of Knox Chapel. The cross and the communion table that you see here are still present to welcome those seeking a smaller and more intimate worship space. Many of the books from the Ewart College Library are still part of the collection at Caven Library. You can find the Ewart stamp inside the covers. Much of the older Christian education curriculum has been cataloged and is available for historical study in the Mackay Historical Curriculum Collection. The Mackay Educational Resource Center is now located inside the reading room of Caven Library rather than downstairs in a classroom. Its focus is on Christian formation resources for churches, but also, in the spirit of Ewart College, the many diverse ways the church seeks to be communities of hope in the world. And what was called the Ewart Chair of Christian Education has a new name, the Ewart Chair in the Practice of Ministry and Faith Formation. Names matter. The church changes. Sometimes names must change too if they're to reflect contemporary realities.
But what about the legacy of Ewart College beyond physical space and objects? Ewart graduates are still active within the church and beyond it. With the amalgamation with Knox, recruitment to the order of diaconal ministries slowed, but there are, of course, still diaconal ministers at work in the Presbyterian Church in Canada today. These include people like Terry Lee Hamilton, Senior Administrator at the General Assembly Office; Donna McElveen, who will receive the 2024 inaugural Principals Award for Faithful Service and Distinguished Leadership from Presbyterian College at its June convocation; and Tori Smith, recently retired as the Regional Minister for Faith Formation for the Synod of Central, Northeastern Ontario and Bermuda. Tori is also currently President of APSE, the Association of Partners in Christian Education. Some diaconal ministers have been ordained to the ministry of Word and Sacraments. Others carry out their ministries in fields not directly connected to the church. And we must also remember the legacy of many retired deaconesses and diaconal ministers that continues to be felt in the lives of those they influenced. From home to school to college, from deaconesses to diaconal ministers, from missionary training to Christian education to the practice of ministry and faith formation. The names associated with Ewart College have changed with the needs of the world around it. What has remained constant is the adaptability of the college and its graduates, their willingness to go where needed, and to respond to shifting social landscapes with courage, creativity, and love. These qualities are still evident in our programs and students today, whatever name they bear. In them, the spirit of Ewart College is alive and well.
If you would like to learn more about Ewart College or the Order of Diaconal Ministries, we recommend these two books. To Keep the Memory Green is a history of Ewart College. From the Bottom Up is a history of the Presbyterian Church in Canada's Order of Diaconal Ministries. Both are available in Caven Library at Knox College. Thank you everyone for attending. I do hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you have any further questions, do feel free to reach out to us either here at Caven Library, and I'm sure the archives would also be happy to answer your questions. So we hope this has helped you. So thank you and goodbye.